Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this Norwegian launch of the Asian Development Outlook of the Asian Development Bank, ADB. My name is Indra Overland. I'm the head of the Russia and Eurasia group at NUPI. And my only task is just to tell you, to give a very brief introduction to this event and to the speakers. I'm glad that we have so many people here because most of Norwegian development effort and people who work on development are not really interested in Asia. But of course there are lots of people who are interested in Asia, and most of them are not really interested in development. They're interested in other things. So it's good to see that there are so many people here. Because Asia is key to world development. Around, depending on your definition, around 60% of the poor people in the world live in Asia, and nowhere in the world has so many people been moved out of poverty in the last couple of decades as in Asia. And of course, as we all know, China is becoming, as an individual country, is becoming as important to the world economy as the US. If there's a hard or smooth landing in China, or an uptick or downtick, it'll impact on everything from the oil price, which is the only thing we care about in this country, to the mundane things that they care about in all other countries, like inflation, interest rates, and jobs, and so on. And at the same time as there's this incredible economic success in Asia, and a lot of people have been lifted out of poverty, inequality is also growing. And this year the ADB has taken a special grasp on this question. So this report is topical and important, and it shows that, it's a part of a picture in which Asia is important for development and development is important for Asia. We are very lucky today to have the State Secretary or Deputy Minister in practice, Hans Bratsgaard, who will give will give a keynote speech. And he is not only State Secretary, he is also a diplomat, I believe, and has worked in several countries in Asia, including Malaysia and Sri Lanka, where he has been ambassador. And he also has a PhD, which in the context of our institute gives a particular legitimacy. Then the Asian Development Outlook report for 2014 will be presented by Zhuzhong Zhuang, if my pronunciation is correct, who is Deputy Chief Economist of ADB's Economics and Research Department, and who has worked on growth, poverty and inequality, structural transformation, the economics of climate change, and the Chinese economy, among other things, and recently has edited a number of books. And then after the presentation of the Development Outlook, we will have a panel of three distinguished experts. Olaf Chen, who is Senior Portfolio Manager at Storebrand's Global Tactical Asset Allocation, which manages over 30 funds with a total value of over 50 billion kroners. And he is one of the people in Norway who is most profiled in speaking on the Chinese economy, and probably one of the few people in Norway who's not only interested in the Chinese economy, but who knows something about it. And we have tried quite hard to find somebody who could say something about the Chinese economy for this event, and it was surprisingly difficult. Our second panelist is Arne Melchior, who's a senior research fellow at NUPI at this institute, is the former head of the Department of International Economics at this institute for many years, former deputy director of this institute, and also worked prior to that for the Ministry of Trade, where he was involved in trade negotiations between Norway and a dozen Asian countries. Finally, we have Francesca Jensenius, who's also a senior research fellow at this institute, is an India expert, speaks Hindi, has studied at Delhi University, Duke, and Berkeley, where she has her PhD from, and is not an economist, but will add a little bit of a different perspective on development, since development is not only about economics. So, on that note, I will give the word to Gatsgaard.
Thank you so much, and good morning to all of you. It's very nice to see you here, and I would like to thank the Asian Development Bank and NUPI for giving me this opportunity to say a few words this morning. And the topic for this event is of great importance in our efforts to enable inclusive growth and fight poverty. And I'm certainly one of those very interested in development issues in Asia, and I will continue to be so. I think that's true for all of us in this room and many others in our country. But the fact is that the world map is changing before our eyes, and we need to navigate accordingly as we look at the world changing around us. Just a few opening remarks on what is happening has happened over the last few decades. In 1980, the U.S. economy was 10 times the size of China's. Today, 3 decades later, U.S. economy is only twice the size of China's. And if present trends continue, China is likely to have the world's largest economy sometime over the next decade. In addition, the value of world trade has increased 8-fold since China had Mao as its leader. We also now talk about the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and also the so-called MINT countries of Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. All of them economic giants, if you would like, emerging in this world. These developments provide us with great opportunities, but also with many challenges. And I would like to thank the Asian Development Bank for keeping us up to date on developments in a very exciting part of the world. And your analytical capacity and knowledge sharing is most appreciated by us all. The good news is, of course, that you tell us that the world's financial risks are easing and appears to be manageable. The not so good news is that we also see a widening of income gaps in Asia. The poorest are often left behind, undermining growth that has already lifted millions out of poverty. We hope to see this trend reversed. Many interesting findings in the Asian Development Bank, and we support many of the findings that you outline. Let me mention some of them. Firstly, financial resources are, as well as sound fiscal management and policy, needed to tackle the challenges ahead and enable inclusive growth. Secondly, efforts aimed at fostering equality and inclusive growth must be strengthened. Thirdly, access to education and health is of crucial importance in order to secure inclusive growth. This is why the Norwegian government gives education and health the highest priority in our development cooperation. There are also additional challenges. The recently published report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, reminds us about the serious threats our world faces from a changing climate. We are ill-prepared, and we must find the required political will to meet these threats and to support green growth. So let us look at how we can mobilize the large pool of existing assets more efficiently to meet the social, economic, and environmental development needs. We know that domestic mobilization of public resources will not be sufficient, and the contribution of official development assistance is likely to continue to decrease as the economic development takes hold in poorer countries. The size of the aid budgets in themselves is insignificant compared to other financial flows like private investments, trade, and remittances. Not to mention the potential that might be released by curbing illicit financial flows out of developing countries. We must be creative when planning how future sustainable development goals shall be financed. A broad and comprehensive financing framework is needed. This is recognized in the follow-up of the Monterrey Consensus, and it's recognized in the follow-up of the Rio Plus 20 discussions on sustainable development goals and the financing of these goals. Norway has now taken a role as co-facilitator in preparation for the third UN conference on financing for development. It is our hope that this conference will bring together related processes and provide the basis for future development financing. The underlying premise of the Monterrey Consensus is that each country has the primary responsibility for its own economic and social development. Public resource mobilization has increased dramatically since the turn of the century. Government tax revenues in emerging markets and developing countries have increased more than fivefold since 2000, with tax revenues as a percentage of GDP from around 13% in the year 2000 to around 18% in 2011. Nevertheless, it's important to underline there is still a significant gap between developed and developing countries in their capacity to raise public revenues. According to the UN Task Force on the post-2015 development agenda, tax to GDP ratios are 13% in low-income countries compared to 35.4% in OECD countries. As the ADB rightly highlight in the outlook, there's a need to strengthen many countries' financial policies, including revenue collection and tax systems. Financial secrecy resulting in illicit capital flows and the services of tax havens also need to be tackled. According to Global Financing Integrity, an amount 10 times the value of official development assistance is siphoned from developing countries every year through illicit financial flows. And according to a recent OECD publication, more than half of these illicit financial flows were in or from Asia. Illicit capital flows and the use of tax havens may have grave consequences. When such money is used to finance criminal or terrorist activities, political and social stability and eventually democracy itself might be at risk. If these flows are stemmed, effective countries would significantly improve their potential to finance most of their own development needs. Illicit financial flows seriously stimulate inequality and undermine stability. Decisions on the level of taxation in a country should, of course, be made by these countries themselves, but through an open and democratic process. But lack of capacity, corruption, and exploitation often stand in the way of a fair and equitable system of taxation. Transparency and capacity building are therefore fundamental enablers of sound financial policies. I am grateful for the work the bank is doing to draw attention to the need for sound financial policies to secure inclusive growth. And we all thank you for sharing your findings here in Norway, and we very much look forward to your presentation. Thank you for your attention.
You'll be okay. Okay. Yes, I can help you. Okay.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think the ADB team is very pleased to visit Oslo and to present latest Asian Development Outlook, the key findings. And so first of all, I would like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the NUPI, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs for hosting this event. And also, I think I would like to take this opportunity to thank Norway, a key ADB donor country, for the continued support for ADB. Now, the Asian Development Outlook normally has two parts. One is on outlook, the other one is on key development issues. So this year, we are looking at the role of fiscal policy in addressing rising inequality. So let me first, let's go to the first part, the outlook. But let me just go through these key messages of this report. Now, steady growth is forecast for developing Asia. We see growth stay steady, 6.2% in 2014 and 6.4% in 2015. The last year was 6.1%. Now, we see growth is to be supported by improved outlook of advanced economies, but will offset somewhat by growth moderation in China. Now, risks have receded compared to last year, but there are still a few areas for carefully watching. I will come to that point later. And the fiscal policy is needed to tackle the rising inequality. So that is the key messages of this report. Now on economic outlook. Broadly, we see developing Asia has done well in responding to the changing global environment that started in the middle of last year when the U.S. signaled tapering of QE, quantitative easing. And despite financial volatility experienced in some parts of the region, developing Asia managed to grow at 6.1% last year. And this year, because of the improved outlook of advanced countries, and so we see growth will pick up slightly to 6.2%, and next year will be 6.4%. But of course, as I said, growth will be, the momentum will be offset somewhat by China's growth moderation. And even with that, the 6.2%, 6.4%, of course, means the Asia, developing Asia will remain the fastest growing region in the world and the largest contributor to the global growth. Now, the advanced countries' outlook we see is improving, and the major industrialized economies, basically we're looking at the G3, the United States, Eurozone, and Japan. Combined GDP is projected to grow at 1.9% this year. This is almost double the rate of the last year. Last year it was 1%. And we see growth to strengthen further to 2.2% next year. Of course, the U.S. is phasing out the unconventional monetary policy, and the recent economic data show continued strengthening of economic momentum. Eurozone is to get out of recession this year and grow at 1%, and further strengthen to 1.4% next year. Although there are few areas, economic indicators show that weaknesses, for instance, level of unemployment and public debt and the deflationary pressure. Japan is projected to grow 1.3% this year and the next year also. Now, Japan, of course, just introduced VAT, hiked VAT from 5% to 8% on the 1st of April. So that will have some negative impact on domestic demand. But we see this impact will, to a larger extent, offset by the fiscal stimulus. And of course, Japan, for the Japanese economy to consolidated game, we see the Abenomics has achieved some impact. But in order to consolidate the games, it's important that the government will fast track the third arrow of the structural reform, third arrow of the Abenomics, basically structural reform. Now, in developing Asia, of course, sub-regional performance differ. South Asia, we see growth to pick up this year from last year because of recovery in India. Southeast Asia growth this year is to remain steady before picking up next year. Central Asia and East Asia will maintain steady growth this year and next year. In East Asia, as I mentioned, China's growth is to moderate, but other economies, for instance, Hong Kong, China, Republic of Korea, and Taipei, China, where growth will pick up, so offset each other. And the Pacific growth will pick up mainly because of the largest economy in Pacific, the Papua New Guinea, is expanding its exports and production of natural gas. Now, a little bit more on China's growth moderation. As I said, China's growth is to moderate from 7.7% last year to 7.5% this year and 7.4% next year. As China continues to move towards a more balanced growth model. Now, the growth moderation is a result of a number of factors. The first, of course, is that the country, the development strategy in terms of government strategy focus is shifting from quantity to quality of growth. So that will have impact on the local government incentives. The second is the measures to control credit growth and to tackle shadow banking and local government debt. This will have a negative impact on growth in the short term, but of course in the medium term, long term, will make growth more sustainable, including also the efforts to reduce overcapacity. But of course, China's growth moderation also reflects the fact that as a country income rises and its growth rate is going to slow down. But even with that, 7.5%, 7.4% is still very healthy and robust. And our projection, although we don't have an official projection published, but we do have internal projection for our operation the planning, is that we see China has a potential to grow at 7 to 7.5% for the next 5 or 6 years until 2030, because we know that the government, Chinese government, the target is that between 2010 to 2020, the target is to double the size of GDP, the constant in 2010 price. So that comes up like the annual average growth rate will be 7.2% for the 10 years period. So we see that there's a potential, of course this is on the potential, from 7 to 7.5% for the next 5 to 6 years up until 2020. So this on China. India. India, of course, last year experienced the larger financial volatility in the middle of the last year because of the after U.S. signal tapering, and to a large extent because India had some weakness in economic fundamentals in terms of high inflation and a larger fiscal account deficit and current account deficit. And the government took a series of measures to promote exports, control imports, and attract foreign capital. So current account deficit has reduced substantively, and inflation, of course, is being reduced, and as well as the fiscal account deficit. So now the economy has stabilized, and the currency has appreciated a little bit, and also the stock markets. So we see the Indian economy growth is to pick up from 4.9% to 5.5% this year, 4.9% last year, 5.5% this year, and 6% next year. If assumption is that the government will push ahead the needed reform, especially to address the infrastructural bottlenecks and regulatory barriers, basically to promote capital investment. But even with that, the issue is with that growth rate, 5.5%, 6%, still underperforms India's own growth potential. So basically what we say is that it's really important that structural reform will be speeded up to address the constraints to growth, mainly the infrastructure bottlenecks and the regulatory barriers that constrain growth. Now, in Southeast Asia, of course, Southeast Asia very open, mostly open economy and very much trade-oriented. So they are going to benefit a lot from the improved outlook of advanced countries, especially in the US and the Eurozone. But there are country-specific factors that will shape the region's growth. Indonesia, for instance, last year again also experienced the larger financial volatility, and because of the larger current deficit as well as inflation. So the government took measures, not economy stabilized, but interest rates remain high, and there are the constraints growth in terms of infrastructure and investment climate remain there. So we see growth remain steady this year at 5.7% before picking up to 6% next year. Malaysia is going to benefit a lot from improved outlook of the advanced countries, but the government is trying to address the fiscal deficit. That will impact somewhat on the domestic demand, but still growth is to pick up from 4.7% to 5.1% this year and 5% next year. The Philippines last year growth was very strong, but this year we see growth tip off somewhat to 6.4 before picking up 6.7%. And of course, the Philippines is doing the reconstruction in response to Yolanda, but we see that impact on growth will come through only in the second half of this year. Thailand is because of the political instability, growth will remain flat this year, 2.9%, the same as last year. But if the political situation improves, we see growth pick up to 4.5% next year. So these are basically the major economies, the growth, the situation. Now, global commodity price remains soft. So we see global food prices will remain soft because after last year it declined by on average 7%. And this year will remain soft because of the improved supply conditions. And oil price we see will be elevated but remain soft. So against that background, during the developing issues, inflation will be in check. Slightly increase up to 3.6% this year from 3.4% last year and 3.7% next year. Now, the pickup is mainly reflecting the fact that some countries will take advantage of soft oil price to reduce fuel subsidies, for instance, Indonesia and India. So that will pick up making inflation slightly higher. But overall, it's in check. Current account surplus has declined for region as a whole. Now it is hovering around 2% for last 5 years. Now this is driven mainly by China. China's current account surplus as a percentage of GDP has been declining dramatically over the last few years. Now it's about 2%. So that means that China is moving more towards the domestic reliance on domestic demand. So what we say is that rebalancing is taking place. Of course, a lot more needs to be done. Now the risks. So we see the overall risks to the region receded compared to last year. But still, there are a few areas for carefully watching. The first is that renewed volatility, the global financial market volatility associated with shift in U.S. monetary policy. This cannot be ruled out. We still there is a possibility that more volatility can come. Second is the weaker than expected recovery in advanced countries, especially the Eurozone, because of the weak economic data in unemployment rate, public debt, credit growth, and deflationary pressure. So there's still a possibility that growth will be slower than what we expected. The third risk is deeper than anticipated slowdown in China's growth. As the government tries to control credit growth, but if this will be carried out too excessive, could undermine growth. But overall, we feel risks have lessened and they are manageable. Now, I just want to show this slide. The last year, as I said, after U.S. signaled tapering of QE, the emerging markets are under pressure. So we found that countries with weaker fundamentals are more vulnerable to shocks. So the weaker fundamentals, here we're talking about high inflation rate, high fiscal deficit, and larger current account deficit. For instance, in this chart show that several Asian countries' currency under pressure during the middle of last year, but Indonesia and India currency depreciation, extended depreciation far more greater than others, for instance, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, because Indonesia and India had a larger current account deficit, but on the other hand, other countries had current account surplus. So what is the conclusion is that the regions, the Asia, developing Asia, should continue to work hard to improve their economic fundamentals. Now, that table is basically showing that a few indicators for kind of a measured vulnerability. So we see, for instance, in the case of Indonesia, bank lending, the credit growth is very high at 22%. And the Philippines also high 17%, the year-on-year credit growth. And inflation, of course, India and Indonesia inflation remain high, needs to be brought down. And current account deficit, Indonesia, and of course, compared to last year, lower, brought down substantively, but remain concerned. So the point I want to make, we try to make is that we need stronger fundamentals in order to reduce economic vulnerability. So I think that concludes my the first part presentation on the economic outlook. So let me now turn to the issue of inequality and the role of fiscal policy, how to address that. Let me start showing this chart. Basically, the developing Asia growth has been very rapid in the last 20 years. Annual average GDP growth is 7%, 7% for developing Asia, and the cumulative poverty reduction is about 32 percentage points in 20 years' time. So we're talking about 700 million Asians were lifted out of poverty during 2 decades. However, this rapid growth and rapid poverty reduction has been accompanied by rising inequality in many countries. We found that 80% of the Asians live in countries with rising inequality. These countries included China, India, and Indonesia, the 3 most populous countries in the region. So these are a list of 12 countries experienced rising inequality. Now, the question is so we also looked at Asia's level of Gini coefficient compared to the global other regions. Now, actually, Asia's inequality, if we look at the Gini coefficient, the Gini coefficient 0 means perfect equality, 100 means perfect inequality. So that's the measure we use. If we look at the Gini coefficient, Asia's inequality is not the highest compared to others. If you look at Latin America actually has the highest Gini coefficient. For the median, Gini is about 52. So Asia, developing Asia, is about 37. Of course, OECD countries about 30. But OECD countries, of course, they have a larger the impact from the tax and the transfers. So in developing Asia, tax and transfer impact on Gini coefficient is very small, almost negligible. So the point is we try to make it is that Asia's level of inequality is not the highest, but the question is the pace of increase, rapid pace of increase, is a major concern. In China, case of China, for instance, Gini coefficient increased from about 30 in the early 90s to 43 or 42 in late 2000. So that the rapid increase is a major concern. Now, why are we concerned about inequality? Because first of all, the inequality slows down, rising inequality slows down the pace of poverty reduction. We did a simulation. If the inequality has not increased in the 12 countries I just highlighted, and then for Asia as a whole, an additional 240 million population would have been lifted out of poverty. This is about 6.5% of the Asian population. So rising inequality slows down poverty reduction. Now, secondly, is that rising inequality weakens the basis of growth itself. There's a number of channels. One is the leading to waste of human capital, and impact on the lead to social tension. This is an instability that is very important, and also hollowing out the middle class and worsen the quality of governance, and increase the pressure for inefficient populist policies. So these are the channels we're concerned about why rising inequality undermines growth itself. Now, let me just briefly talk about the drivers of rising inequality. What has happened? Now, what has happened in the last 20 or 30 years? Rapid growth has been driven by, in Asia, has been driven by technology progress, globalization, and market-oriented reforms. Now, these forces are the drivers of growth, but they also had significant distributional consequences. Working together, these forces have favored capital over labor, and favored skilled workers over unskilled workers, and favored cities and coastal regions over rural and inland areas. Now, the capital income is less equally distributed. Labor income is more equally distributed. So if something more equally distributed is declining, that means inequality will rise. Again, you have the larger population unskilled workers and smaller size in terms of skilled workers. So that the income gap will increase. And city, coastal regions, of course, are richer than rural and inland areas. So richer groups are getting richer faster than the lower income. So of course, inequality will rise. So these are the basic forces of the rising inequality. And also, these forces, the impact have been compounded by unequal access to opportunity because of the poor governance and because of the social exclusion. So if we want to address the rising inequality, that is the area we should focus on to reduce inequality in opportunities by eliminating social exclusion and improve governance. Because the technology progress, globalization, and market-oriented reforms, these are the forces of the drivers of growth we cannot stop. Now here I just have show some empirical evidence. I said this driver of growth have favored capital over labor. So we have empirical evidence showing that labor income share as a labor income share in value added for the manufacturing sector, or actually for the GDP, has been declining. For instance, in the case of China, this is for manufacturing sector, labor income share declined from 48% in the middle 1990s to 42% in middle 2000. So as I said, the labor income is more equally distributed, capital income less equally distributed. So more equally distributed components declining, so the inequality will rise. Now here also shows the skill premium. Basically, the growth has favored skilled and over unskilled work. So basically, we have observed among many countries, skill premium has increased. And this is, in fact, the case. So we see that proportion of inequality, which can be explained by educational differences, has been increasing over time in many countries. In case of China, for instance, in 1995, 8% of inequality can be explained by educational differences. But in 2007, this number increased 26%. 26% can be explained by the difference in education. So the skill premium has been rising. That is also one of the causes. A third is spatial inequality. I talk about the urban-rural versus the urban coastal on one hand, and the other hand is rural and inland province states. So that is basically geographical difference or income gap, or we call it spatial inequality, has been very significant. In the case of China, for instance, more than 50% of the inequality can be explained by spatial inequality. So here, spatial inequality is a combination of urban-rural income gap and regional inequality. So these are the drivers of the inequality. Then how to respond to rising inequality? Now this is basically 2 years ago we have another report on the ADO is focusing on inequality itself. Basically, we, in terms of policy response, we say that the three drivers of growth cannot be hindered. I mean, globalization, technology progress, and market-oriented reforms cannot be stopped. But the question is, of course, governments have to respond. But the government can respond by, first of all, making growth more employment-friendly, so creating more jobs, and jobs to reach a larger section of the population. So that will help to increase labor demand and increase the wages and increase labor income share. The second is develop lagging regions to reduce spatial inequality, especially reduce urban-rural inequality and regional inequality, for instance, by improving the regional infrastructure. Third is to make use of efficient fiscal policy to reduce inequality in human capital. So that is the focus of this year's Simcha come to now. And fourthly, we need to improve good governance, to eliminate social exclusion. So that is how we conceptualize that way, the inequality, and how to respond to that. So now let me turn to the fiscal policy. The one of the policy, the option. So basically, we see Asia has a large scope to use fiscal policy in addressing rising inequality. Here we look at the education, public spending on education, on health, and social protection. So these are the so-called equity enhancing programs, right? Equity enhancing programs. So if we look at the education, for instance, developing Asia currently spend 2.9% of GDP on education. This is public spending, compared to 5.5% for Latin America and 5.3% for OECD countries. So Asia spent far less on education, on health, and on education. The difference between developing Asia and other regions even greater if we look at health and social protection. So now we said that Asia needs to make great use of fiscal policy to address rising inequality. Now we believe that fiscal spending is more effective than just revenue side. So first is that to use fiscal spending to address inequality by increasing spending on education, health, and social protection. So that is a starting point. Now the question is, spending needs to be financed. If we want to increase spending, either you divert the current spending, for instance, on other areas to these programs, or you find more revenue in order to make sure that the country is fiscally sustainable. Fiscal sustainability is very important. So now then we look at fiscal space, whether Asia has a fiscal space to spend more on education, on health, and on social protection. So then we look at this government debt, the gross government debt as percent of GDP. In 2012, for developing Asia as a whole, gross government debt as a percent of GDP was about 36%. So compare with 80%, about 80% for the global average. So from that numbers, we can see that it seems to us that Asia has some fiscal space to spend more on education, on health, and social protection. But on the other hand, if we look at region's long-term challenge, fiscal needs to address long-term challenge, here we're talking about population aging and the challenge of climate change to address environmental protection, then the region's fiscal situation actually is not that rosy. Now here we look at on the right-hand side, we did a simulation. Currently, the Asia spent about 2.4% of public spending of GDP, 2.4% of GDP on health care. But by 2050, because of the aging population, the number is going to increase to 7.3%. So, and for East Asia, for instance, because where population aging is more pronounced, the number is even greater. So from that, we see that actually, if you look at the long-term challenges, the fiscal situation for Asia is not that rosy. So the question is how the government should do. I mean, when you have a low spending on this equity enhancing program, on the other hand, you don't really have much fiscal space if you consider medium and long-term challenges. So we say that Asia must also strengthen the revenue side if you want to increase spending on education or health, same time if you want to maintain fiscal sustainability. So we look at the revenue side. The revenue total tax revenue for developing Asia as a whole, as a percent of GDP, is about 20% in 2010. So that compares with 25% for Latin America and 28% for OECD. So basically, Asia needs to spend that broaden, increase, strengthen the revenue base. I think at this stage, if you look at the composition of the tax revenue, developing Asia collected far less revenue from personal income tax, from property tax, and from social contribution. So these are among the areas we need to focus on. So the report suggests that the Asian countries, of course, country situation will differ from country to country, and the exact policy solution will be differ from country to country. But as a whole, a wide range of options should be explored. The first is to broaden the base for personal income tax and VAT. In countries where the VAT does not exist, VAT should be introduced. So basically, to broaden tax base by eliminating or reducing exemptions, deductibles, and the tax incentives. Not necessarily to increase tax rates, but reduce or eliminate deductibles and the tax incentives and exemptions. The second is to make great use of collective taxes. Collective taxes, here we're talking about like sin tax on the cigarettes and alcohol, and green tax on environmental protection should make great use of it. And also the non-tax revenues, here we're talking about the fees and the user charges. The Asia's use of non-tax revenue is also small compared to other regions. And the third is to introduce taxes on property, capital gains, and inheritance. Asian countries, very few Asian countries have inheritance tax. I think there's 4 only. So that needs to be looked at. And of course, these taxes are, by nature, they're progressive. And thirdly, the last one is very important, is to improve collection and tax administration and reduce or to the scope for tax evasion by strengthening enforcement. So this is very important through the introduction of ICT technology, develop database and the records, all these things. So these are broader broad options Asian country needs to consider. Of course, depending on the country's circumstances, they have decided their own the exact option. In the case of China, for instance, personal income tax as a percent of GDP is less than 1.5%. Very few population pay personal income tax. So I think there's a larger scope for China to increase to have a more personal income tax. Now, finally, we basically how to put all this into practice. So we emphasize the planning for fiscal policy, for inclusive growth fiscal policy, and by introducing medium-term fiscal policy framework. That one in many in Asia is not very common, but I understand that in OECD countries become a lot more common, and also in Latin American countries, medium-term fiscal framework is common. Basically, you identify for the medium term on the basis of 35 years, have a inclusive growth program and find funding sources and ensure the fiscal sustainability. So I will not read the key messages again. And so finally, I would like to thank everyone for attention. And also I would like to thank State Secretariat for coming here, for opening the session and from your very busy schedule. Thank you very much.
Yes, maybe that is a good idea. So you guys can use these first because you don't need to pay anything. Would you like to say something in any special order, or
How long should we talk?
3, 4, 5 minutes? Olaf, would you like to go first, or would you like to as the guest?
Sure. I'll go first.
Okay, so now our panel of distinguished experts will comment on the report and on the general economic and development outlook in Asia. We'll start with Olaf Chen.
Hello.
Yeah.
I just talk without.
No, you should use a microphone, ideally, because we're recording everything. Let me see if
No, hör mig. Thank you for the presentation, Yuzong. As mentioned in the introduction, I work in the as a portfolio manager, as an economist, and follow China very closely. But our investment strategy is mainly global. But we have seen in the recent years that China is becoming more and more important. And my focus is amongst many different areas, China. And I recently came back from a trip in China, actually, 2 days ago. I was there for 2 weeks with lots of impression. And I think we, or I, share most of your views on Asia and China. I think, especially if you read the Norwegian press and the Norwegian Business Daily, you get the impression that China is heading for a hard landing, and you have a so-called Lehman moment after some small defaults. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that's a big exaggeration, and especially the comparison with the Lehman event, because I mean you have come from the financial crisis in the US, which was a housing bubble that burst, and then you had the European sovereign debt bubble, and now people are comparing China as like the third leg of the different big bubbles going to burst. I don't think that's the case at all. I think there will come several small defaults, but controlled ones. I think people in general, especially among Western analysts, don't know how much control the government actually have over the Chinese economy, not only on the markets but also on the economy. Referring to the hard landing case, I think even most of the consensus prognosis is around 7 to 75% GDP growth. I think many market participants are having a much lower growth rate, and when you're talking about hard landing, I think people are talking about 3 or 4%. But after my trip from China, I'm more confident that actually they will deliver 7 to 7.5 GDP growth in this year as well. Even though the first quarter was very weak and probably below the target, so they have to boost in some kind of way to turn the momentum, because the momentum in the growth and the economy is still slowing, but it's not like hard landing. And most of it is wanted because, as also you said, they want to shift the focus from quantity to more quality. I mean, earlier you have quantity. One of my anecdotes, which I think is very funny and very relevant, is when for a couple of years ago, I went to visit some local governments, and usually I never met a local government, but what they start to introduce themselves with is actually the GDP numbers. GDP. I mean, if you go to a Norwegian commune or something, people are not starting with my GDP numbers in Hedmark commune or Oslo commune, right? But in China, they started off with the GDP numbers, everyone, and they were like bragging. We had like 10%, 15% investments, so on. I mean, that was the target, and that was their way of advancing in the system. If they delivered on the quantitative growth targets, they advanced, right? So of course they tried to deliver on the growth and ignored some of the qualitative side. For example, pollution. The other big takeaway from my trip is the pollution. It has worsened a lot during the last 2 years. I mean, I'm in China almost every year to check the pulse and how the economy is developing. But Beijing this time and the area around there was horrible. I've never seen this kind of pollution. You didn't see the sun at all. And someone told me during the trip that the level of pollution that day was 8 times the level in Bergen when everyone was complaining and half the city was closed down. 8 times, and they have never done any research what this kind of level can do when it comes to future health. So I think the government is actually doing something with it, because pollution is hitting everyone. It's hitting the poor ones, but also the wealthy ones with power and money and something to say, right? So I think the government has sent a clear message that it will do something on the development, not only high growth numbers, but also the quality, and you have to do something with the pollution. And the third, I'm gonna round off here. Takeaway I had from my trip is that there are big reforms going on. One is the clamping down on the pollution and turn it from quantitative to quality, but there are also big financial reforms, big reforms to crack down corruption. So from that trip, I'm more certain that they will deliver on the short term, but I think on the longer term, there will be more could be potential for more volatility, because what we have seen in the Chinese economy and development is the stability, right? I mean, people are talking about hard landing every year. It's nothing new. I've heard about hard landing or different cases of Lehman or ghost cities or whatever every year for the last decade, right? So, but with these kind of financial reforms and other reforms like cracking down corruption and everything, I think in the longer term there might be more volatility unless they really are successful doing those bold reforms.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Arne, would you like to follow on?
Okay, does it work?
Yep.
Okay, very good. So I have some notes here, but the time is scarce, so I think I'll be more free. First, I would like to just to make some advertisement for a second seminar on Asia that we'll have this spring. NUPI made a study for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Norway, Asia, and the global value chains. So about Asia's growth and Norway's economic links to Asia. Actually, as a kind of discussant and participant, we also have Dong-Yun Park from the ADB, who is also one of the lead authors of the report presented here. He will be here at the seminar 22nd of May, and also in one park was written about trade agreements in Asia. So you can come back, and you can, in the meantime, you can read this report and get it on our website. So for Norway, of course, the growth of Asia is a fantastic thing because of the it has added to low import prices and high export prices. So actually, one of the things mentioned in this study is that if you take the year 2000 and year 2012 and consider the development of export and import prices for Norway, you find that Norway got a gift of about 27% of GDP. And this cannot be sustained, of course, in the long run, because you cannot expect this rise in commodity prices. And although we are used to perceive Asia as the kind of manufacturing workshop of the world, in the report you also mentioned that some countries in Asia are also commodity based. So they face some of the same challenges as Norway. We cannot expect this trend to continue with the growing terms of trade gain, but the continued growth of Asia, in spite of kind of some doomsday stories, tell us that will of course contribute to sustained high demand for commodities, which will be important for Norway. So yeah, so Asia has of course huge challenges in building welfare states with enormous challenges, for example, on aging in some countries, especially some of the advanced countries. I went to Singapore in December. I started talking to my taxi driver, and he said that he would work until he dropped, and he knew someone who would commit suicide. Or the old people would work to their very old age because they had no option. The old age, the pension system for some people of the population was limited. So even kind of advanced states would have big challenges on some welfare state issues that are of growing importance. And of course, education and health are very important issues combined with infrastructure. So this study of ADB is really a timely contribution to raise very, very important issues and challenges. Norway has for the commodity producers, Norway has the experience of the Petroleum Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is kind of experience that other countries may look into. If you go to the kiosk, you will also see that that on taxing cigarettes, Norway has some hints about how to get revenues for the states that are in desperate need for more cash. So about the challenges. So I'll find the right page. So there is something about for example, I will raise it as a kind of the China paradox and the Latin America paradox. So the China paradox is that the country which is most successful in getting rid of poverty is also on the lead in the Gini increase. So how can you reconcile these facts? I mean, how can the country which has been so successful in getting people out of poverty is also leading the inequality index rise? The second, the Latin America paradox is you show the spending as percentage of GDP for Asia, for Latin America and OECD, and then you see that Latin America is much higher. But what will happen if you do like Latin America? Will you also get the inequality of Latin America? Of course not. It's just a rhetorical question, but of course Latin America has a very high level of inequality, so higher spending is not a guarantee. So so I'll kind of say a few things about what kind of resolves these paradoxes. And one of the issues is, of course, that to share the cake, you have to bake it. So it's easy to agree, for example, that infrastructure is very important, education is very important, and health is very important. So, but you need money to construct the roads and to develop the schooling education system and the health and the old people's pensions. So you need kind of policy focus, but also economic growth. So, of course, for China, the basic issue is that they have created a lot of jobs, 170 million jobs in manufacturing and services, whereas, for example, India, they have not created. There is no net creation of jobs in the so-called formal sector. All job creation is in so-called informal sector, often low productivity jobs. And if you look at, for example, revenue, I mean, in India, there was a study of Piketty and Kian a couple of years ago showing that 2-3% of the Indian population pay income taxes. So 30-40 million pay income taxes. So the tax income is very limited. So yeah, so you have to bake the cake and you have to create more tax revenue. Then there is about the Latin America paradox. I will kind of ask the question whether Kuznets is dead or not, because you know, Kuznets is this hypothesis saying that countries pass through a stage where inequality increases and then finally it decreases when all the people get richer. So take the experiments. You have 100 poor farmers. And then they have the option of getting education and moving to the cities, where they will earn 10 times as much. So let one of them move, then the second, and so on. So of course then, as the first guy moves, inequality increases. Actually, if the income is 10 times higher, when one quarter has moved, the inequality is on top. And then after, it will decrease until all the 100 people have got education and moved to the other sectors or places. So that's the kind of technical, mathematical property. So I think it's a bit misunderstood about the Kuznets effect, that some people expected to find it as some kind of grand historical law. The point is that the Kuznets effect is a kind of partial mechanism. So for extensive growth, when people move from one place to another or from one profession to another, you can have a Kuznets effect. But you can have other impacts kind of modifying it, so that you don't find. It was Latin America actually that made some people some years ago to kind of confirm the Kuznets effect. But later econometric work has kind of said it's kind of more uncertain. But I think you should look for the Kuznets effect as a kind of partial mechanism, not as a kind of grand design law of nature, so to speak. So to get on here, I think it's very important to decompose inequality, as you also did in your presentation. So, for example, for the large countries, there is regional disparities, like you showed for China and India, which were on very high up on the ranking. So, yes, sorry, I got my. So one has to decompose inequality. Some studies, for example, show that the share of income of the 40 to 90% is surprisingly constant across countries. So the 10 versus 10 top, the top 10 versus bottom 20 or 40 is kind of most important determinant. And in recent years, you also had the top 1% in some countries. So I think for policy purposes, it's important not to look at the Gini and the level of the Gini, but you have to kind of decompose it as you did. For what if the regional component is dominating? Of course, then you have to build more roads. Probably, it's an argument for infrastructure. to some extent. There are also policy, let's say in India, I'm sure you may mention the Indian variation in, for example, quality of schooling, etc. But if, for example, if it's a grabbing of property which makes the top 1% rich, and that is the driver of inequality, you should have better legal systems or property system. Of course, for many countries, distribution of land is quite important. So, yeah, so I think I spent my time, a very interesting study. So I think there is a need for a lot of work in this area, and this is a very timely contribution. And I would also like to read the background papers that is referred to in the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arne.
Well,
Francesca?
thank you. And I'm happy to see so many of you here, really. And it's really a pleasure to get to engage with this report and get to comment on it. I must say, I want to start with advertising the report, because for those who haven't had the chance to read it, it's really an excellent and very actually simple overview that's really not, it's totally understandable to non-economists as well, and very well funded in research. So I would totally recommend everyone reading the full report. And I'm also very pleased to see the focus you have on inequality in this year's report, because really, I feel at least that in a lot of the media attention on Asia during recent years, we hear a lot about rising Asia and growth and shining India and shining economies. But the reality is, of course, that Asia, and especially India that I work on, is full of contrasts. And one of the most interesting things and important things about Asia is exactly these contrasts, and also the very difficult trade-offs that the region face. Some of the trade-offs are, of course, between growth and inequality, that many see that as mutually exclusive. Some think of growth models as inclusive growth, that it's possible to have both. But it's just, you have to both grow the pie and split the pie at the same time, and that's a huge challenge. It's also easy in these numbers sometimes to forget the human stories in all of this, that we talk about reducing poverty, and the poverty reduction has been huge. But if you look at the statistics, yes, there has been a lot of people who have been lifted out of extreme poverty from below the $1 a day line, but have ended up in the $2 a day line. So I think sometimes when we talk of poverty reduction in terms of statistics, it's easy to forget that $2 a day is still not a luxurious lifestyle, and that really getting people up to a higher level of consumption is both what will increase the quality of standard of living and also enable a growth in the domestic markets, because you need a large middle class to be able to have large domestic markets in these countries. Of course, there are also a huge, just to mention another one, challenge in the trade-off between wanting to protect human rights and natural resources and the need for growth. Because in a lot of these countries, people want to start getting a car, start getting electricity, start getting a washing machine, which has often been an example people give. But that proposes then enormous environmental challenges because the populations are so large. So I think this report is part of putting a focus back on some of these challenges that I think are important. Now, Indra promised that I would come with a different perspective, because I'm not an economist, I'm a political scientist. And for me, one of the things that really struck me in this report is, which of course, it's not a critique at all, but one really needs to think of politics in the context of these statistics and the economics here. Because in a lot of these countries, the political situation really makes it very hard to make strategic economic choices. And you can look at, in the report you mentioned, the security challenge in, for example, Pakistan. So when you have enormous security challenges that the government is struggling with, of course, the government's focus is not necessarily always on fiscal policy, because there is just so much going on in terms of avoiding full-on civil war. And I think in the case of India again, one has to remember that there are large parts of the country that are in conflict and have been under emergency rule for a large period of time, and starting to think of taxing in those areas or even expanding infrastructure to those areas is a huge challenge because of just internal conflict. Thinking also of the upcoming Indian election now, India is about to go into parliamentary elections. This economy has really been about economy, and a lot of the Indian economy has now sort of been on hold. A lot of people are waiting to see if they want to invest in what they want to invest in, exactly because there now is an election between a man who runs on a very pro-business platform and economic growth platform, and other parties that have that maybe less as their focus. And I think also politically it's really interesting to look within countries like China and India and see that there's enormous variation within the country based on political choices. I think, again, Modi, who's the main prime ministerial candidate in India right now, is known for having had great growth in his state of India, Gujarat. But that state has really seen a growth in cities, a growth in urban areas and in the business. And he is known to have helped reduce some of the challenges of permits and corruption related to getting business money in. But he has done nothing for the rural sector and the economic sector, not economic, agricultural sector, which is drastically lagging behind. And so some people are worried about what will happen if he now comes to power in India and will run a similar business model, that what you will again see is more growth in the cities and a lagging behind of the agricultural sector, which again will lead to more inequality in the country. I think if one looks to other states, for example, Kerala in India, they have emphasized much more redistribution, but have then been known to have less growth. While some people are now looking to states like Himachal Pradesh or Tamil Nadu, who have managed to both have a pretty high level of growth and have much more of an inclusive growth structure. So I think actually looking at the economic situation within India and the different states is really informative for how much political choices affect the type of growth you can see. And one also has to remember that a lot of political leaders are extremely constrained by electoral factors in especially the democratic countries, and that becomes very arbitrary. In India, for example, the quality of the monsoon is a huge predictor of vote choice. You see economic voting in India in the way you expect it in the US, for example, but the monsoon quality is what determines that economic voting to a large extent, which means that politicians are restrained by things like the rain, which again is not something they can control. Of course, they can control to what extent that creates shocks in people's lives, but at the same time they do face a lot of electoral constraints. That again is one of those interesting challenges with when you have democracy. You also see the kind of constraint and short-term time horizons for leaders that is not necessarily good for economic growth. And I think I've used my time there, so thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Zhuzhong, would you like to follow up some points?
Just respond. Yeah. Okay. Let me start with the Francesco's the political. Yeah, politics obviously is very important. But now the ADB. Now we have some constraint in getting into too much of the politics. So I just want to explain, because we are a political organization and Indian or our member. So that I just want to clarify. Now, I want to respond to the Kuznets thing. Now, actually, we looked at the mechanism you mentioned about urbanization versus inequality. So urbanization goes, and the inequality will first increase and peak and decline. So this is the one of the Kuznets mechanism he highlighted. So we look at that again, China past the peak, if looking at urbanization and inequality, and Indonesia, India still have a long way to go before reach that. But more important, I think, for Kuznets' hypothesis, he is talking about inequality versus per capita income, not urbanization. Urbanization, there is a section on that. Then, from that perspective, actually, I think his thesis still holds. The reason is that even though empirical evidence show doesn't, or many empirical evidence, because one of the drivers he talked about when the income reaches a certain level decline is politics, the political forces. Middle class rises and demand for redistribution and taxes. So that, of course, depends on the policy. So that means if we consider that, Kuznets' hypothesis will hold. Although empirically may not be necessarily, because depending on the government policy. But he is right in a sense. Later on, it's really the middle class, and so in that sense, we have a chapter on that on that part. I can send you the paper later on that. And then the comment about China. So I think we are very much, we share similar view, and I mean, more optimistic. And especially China last year, for instance, the third plenary of the Communist Party announced, a series of reform measures, basically to allow the market force to play a decisive role. So this is the first time. In the past, China always talk about planning and market force as supplement. Now we're talking about market force will play a decisive role. And private sector development, private sector and state-owned enterprise will compete. In the past, it's state-owned dominant, and the private sector supplement. Now it's different, equally. So I think, of course, China is the constraint in a sense, because constitution is still talk about state ownership. So constitution, but in reality, I think the private sector will be allowed, give it more freedom, and especially, for instance, last month the government, the National Congress People's National Congress meeting, the Congress announced the opening of the many sectors, the private sector. Public utility, railway, electricity, all this, so allowed private sector participation. So that will provide the drivers of China's growth for the coming years. So I just stop from here. Thank you.
Okay, I am wondering whether we have any questions or comments from the floor. Stein? And please present yourself.
I'm Stein Sundstøl Eriksen here from NUPI. I have a question regarding the what you presented as the drivers of growth. You mentioned technological progress, globalization, and market reforms. I won't say anything about technological progress, but on the other two, I have questions or comments. Regarding globalization, you said that this has been a driver of growth and that it is unstoppable. Now, that may be the case, but my question, which relates to some of what you said in your presentation, concerns the insecurities about future developments in the global economy. Because although globalization has been a driver of growth, this is not necessarily going to be the case in the future, because that depends on developments in global markets. So globalization may not be a driver of growth in the future. And you mentioned that as a risk yourself. The second one is the third factor that you mentioned, namely market reforms. Now, you said that all these three factors were both drivers of growth and unstoppable. But my question is whether it really is the case that market reforms are unstoppable. And that brings me to some of what Francesca said regarding the importance of politics. Because whether you're going to have market reforms or not is a political issue. And in some countries, there may be political developments that could create a pressure against more market reforms, and even in the direction of reversing some of the market reforms you have said. So, market reforms, although they may have been a driver of growth, albeit with increased inequality as a side effect, may not necessarily be unstoppable. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Take one more question now.
Yes, I'm Pamela Price, recently retired from the University of Oslo and an Indian historian. I was very glad that Francesca mentioned this issue of the monsoon and the dependency of the Indian economy, and therefore also politicians' careers on the monsoon. And as a scholar of India, I'm used to looking in the newspapers regularly to see how the monsoon is doing every year. And I'm aware that more than half of the people in India live in semi-arid zones. I was wondering if those of you who work on China can say something about the dependency of China on monsoon for economic growth and what the water outlook is for China. I understand that large sections of China are also semi-arid. And since you mentioned that you've worked on environmental economics, I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Thank you. Would you like to respond? And if any of the others also would like to say something, you're very welcome.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, on the first question on the the drivers of growth. Now, globalization, we here, of course, we're talking about trade and capital flows. So developing Asia as a whole benefit greatly in China and all other countries. I think as a whole, it's unstoppable. And if you look at, the long term, but the short term, of course, you have protectionism, rise, all this kind of thing, and so inevitable. But as a trend, this is because the through trade and through capital flows, Asian countries benefit a great deal, and also many other countries as well, both developed and developing countries. So I think that might be is the driver of growth is unstoppable and will continue. And as I said, in short term, maybe there are the issues, the protectionism arises also, but in long term, I think market oriented reform is same. Basically, again, China, of course, benefit a great deal. China rapid growth is because of the market-oriented reform. Of course, there are other things, but this is the key. And without that, I cannot imagine China has such high growth rate achieved the last 30 years. But again, the politics will come, sometime from time to time. So you can have reverse or slow down. But overall, as a trend, I think will continue, and the reform, structural reform, and market-oriented reform will continue. So that will benefit a great deal the region, and I think in not just Asia, but other countries as well. The second question on this monsoon, China agriculture, of course, still important in the science sector, and mainly agriculture sector is important. But in terms of contribution to GDP, is about 10%. Of course, the agriculture still employ about 40% of the population. So more in terms of employment, but GDP contribution is now it's very small, 10%. So now the issues relate to the climate change, for instance, has been I mentioned about the water shortage. For instance, water scarcity is become a big issue to a large extent. Empirical evidence. I'm not a scientist, but there are people saying this is a changing water pattern is related to climate change. So that is a big issue, and we have a prediction on that. By 2030, China's water shortage can reach about 10% or 20% of the water supply by that time. Of course, the issue is locational imbalances. Some areas a lot of water, but other areas no water, so it's an imbalance. And of course, also water pollution is a big problem. So then that issue needs to be addressed. Yeah, I think that's from here.
Anybody else would like to add? Arne?
Yes. I get it right. Yes. So yes, just a comment on globalization and in Asia. So Asia has benefited from globalization, especially in the form of being expanding very fast in manufacturing and succeeding in manufacturing exports, and of course, and the whole region with the production networks in Asia has expanded fast. But one area where Asia has been kind of partly integrated in the globalization is in the financial area. And this, for example, with the Asia crisis before the turn of the century, actually some countries in Asia fared better because they were not integrated in the global economy. So they kind of avoided some of the shocks coming from the international financial markets. And I think it's still an important issue, and you still have kind of limitations about the integration in financial markets, global financial markets. I think the research, although it's very difficult to make some kind of sweeping generalization, but the research points to the direction that trade in FDI globalization are good things. But financial globalization is sometimes a mixed blessings because of the shocks involved. So that's an important choice and important issue for Asia. If you look at the United States, for example, over the last 10 years, there is a huge development of international exposure financially. No, I mean, you have FDI and stocks, which is just a small share, but then there is all the rest of it. So the kind of I'm not sure if all of us would agree to be on this, but the point is that it will be important for the strategy on globalization for Asia, how they link to or not to the financial markets. But in this area, we will do some research at NUPI. You mentioned in your presentation this issue about illicit financial flows or capital flow. I don't know, it was Bratskar, I think. So we do some work on so-called mirror data, because trade data is one of the sources of data for kind of quantifying the potential illicit flow. So some people use these deviations between the trade reported at the two ends of each trade flow. There are huge deviations, and some use this data as a kind of proxy to say how much flows are illicit. In this study on Asia, we found that Norwegian imports from Asia is twice as large as Asia's exports to Norway. And we do not say that these are illicit flows. Actually, a lot of it may come from indirect trade, middlemen, trading hubs, etc. So we don't say this is illicit, but this is an important field for Asia, because you have kind of huge swings in these CIF-FOB ratios for trade. I mean, the deviations between. So that's an area we will work on in the future. A final issue I will just like to mention is that when focused on inequality, researchers sometimes tend to focus too narrowly on personal income and consumption. And for Asia, of course, in China, for example, up to 60% of GDP was investment, and which also mattered for the country. In your study, of course, it's about public investment partially. So that's, and then this should also be kind of measured in private consumption, the public kind of contribution to private. But this is a kind of important distinction, because if you only measure what people eat and consume, you don't get the whole picture. There are investment, public and private, is an important component of development.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions myself. Oh, sorry. We have one more here from the audience.
No, go ahead, since you already...
Mine are a little heavy, so I'll let you go first.
Thank you for most interesting presentations. I am Dag Halvorsen. I work in the South Asia section of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but my question pertains to the PRC. I wonder if the strategy a growth strategy based on quality rather than quantity is compatible with reduced inequality. Because if you want to control credits, if you want to reduce shadow banking, if you want to control the debt accumulation in local governments, you need to restrict credit handouts to large state enterprises and to local communities, and you will risk rising unemployment, and you will risk other social conflict. And still there is not yet in place any social protection system, and no handouts, no support for people who have lost their work. And so these reforms must be completed while you already are I mean, social reforms must be implemented while you already have ongoing tough economic changes, and there will be very many difficult political choices resulting from this. And I think the temptation will be to let reforms wait and see and just continue on the current path. Do you see signs that steps are being taken to really go ahead with a more a reform based on consumer-oriented economy, less export, better social system, and so on? And is it really possible to go ahead as fast as you think they should? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Roman.
My name is Roman Vakulchuk. I'm economist at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And my question is very much related to what you've been talking about, the environmental situation, for example, in China, but also in Asia in general, and also the hypothesis that was mentioned by Arne, namely this Kuznets curve. And my question is that we also know of the environmental Kuznets curve, which means that once, for example, the income level is high and the GDP growth also reaches very high level, then the environmental protection will be in place. So the more income gap is diminishing, the more there is a kind of opportunities for protecting the environment. So my question is, to what extent do you think this hypothesis, and I mean this overall kind of thinking, is applicable, for example, to China, but also to the overall growth situation in Asia? So my question is, to what extent do you think it's applicable in the sense that maybe in many societies there is this point has not been reached yet when the societies start thinking about, for example, the environmental protection? Thank you.
Thank you. I will not ask a question, but I'll just, because Dag Halvorsen actually kind of asked a similar question to what I was going to say. But more just a small comment following up the same point. I thought you and the report drew up a really interesting picture of the challenge moving forwards, that Asian countries spend less on various aspects of social welfare, healthcare, education, and so on. And they have less debt. So there is scope for doing more, but looking forwards, so they are going to have more debt and they have more rapidly aging populations. And then you arrive at the conclusion, which is so they should improve their taxation rate, which, as Arne pointed out, like 2-3% of people in India pay tax, which sounds a bit shocking for Norwegians. But then I wondered, hasn't almost all of the countries in Asia, which over the last 50 years have experienced some kind of, 60, 70 years have experienced some kind of rapid growth, Korea, Japan, historically, China nowadays, India too, hasn't it all along been largely export-driven? Also what we're seeing in places like Cambodia or Indonesia nowadays. Export-driven, and the basis for this export-driven growth is cheap labor and docile labor, so cheap, disciplined labor, and that if you increase taxes, things are not going to be so cheap anymore. And also, if you control, as we were saying from the Norwegian side, you need to control the capital flows more. You need to avoid capital flight and so on, which make, on the other hand, also make it less attractive for investors. Not that there are less controls other places, but then maybe one of the comparative advantages is that you can put your money there and then take it back whenever you want to. So that wasn't really so much a question, just following up. I think it's a little bit along the same lines as Dag Halvorsen says. There seems to be maybe some very impressive development in Asia, but also some quite big challenges coming up.
Thank you. Okay, so let me go to this first question, quantity and quality. Now, shift from quantity to quality, I think there's quite a number of, we can think of a number of dimensions. The one is if we shift more on quality, that means we're talking about more balanced growth in terms of sources of growth. So perhaps less relying on external demand, more domestic, shift towards more domestic demand oriented growth path, so growth model. So that is the one area. Secondly is on the more widely shared growth, so basically more inclusive growth. This is also quality. Basically, benefits of growth widely shared, more widely shared by a larger section of population. So this is another dimension of quality. So that is, I think, related to you also mentioned about this relation with inequality. So that actually, in fact, is one of the dimensions we're talking about. Then third, of course, the environment. Less pollution, more sustainable. So so we're talking about the source of growth versus external demand and domestic demand. Within domestic demand, consumption versus investment, right? So that is the shift. The second is more inclusive growth, so basically make growth more widely shared. So another dimension. Third dimension is environment. So these are the things we can think into what we mean by quality of growth. Now, the quality, so these are the things, and then actually the empirical evidence show that things are happening towards good, towards that direction. For instance, if, external versus domestic, external versus domestic. So we see that in the last 3-4 years, private consumption as a percent of GDP has bottomed out, is increasing. Because in the past we have been talking about declining household consumption as a percent of GDP. So then actually what happened is in very recent years bottomed out and started increasing. Secondly is inequality peaked in 2000. This is Kuznets, maybe. I think that is the Kuznets hypothesis is happening. Inequality measured by Gini coefficient per capita household income peaked in 2009 and started declining little in the last few years. So my view is that China's inequality has peaked and probably would stay high for some time and start declining further. Now, one of the factors, of course, the government is taking the policy measures in terms of improving income distribution. For instance, rural income growth, the per capita income, the rural growth of rural income has been faster than growth of urban income in the last few years. And then the growth of coastal province has been slower than the growth of interior provinces. So interior province growth rate is higher over the last many years already. So that suggests that something is happening. Now another thing actually inequality, I relate to your point about the wages. Now wages has been increasing very rapidly over the last few. So we found that actually the growth of real wages is growth rate of real wages faster than the growth rate of labor productivity for the last few years. So that suggests we don't have direct data on the share of the labor income in GDP, but the fact that wage income in real term grow faster than labor productivity, that means labor income share is increasing. So that contributing to household income as a percentage of GDP increasing and household consumption as a percentage of GDP increasing. So that is something is happening, but of course, just happening now. But certainly, I think a lot of things contributed that in terms of policy. For instance, the government recently announced to integrate the urban-rural social security system that is going to implement that will help, and of course improve the welfare of the migrant workers and the policies support the agriculture sector. All this work. Another thing is this development process is something underlying forces is this so-called China reached turning point. So the surplus labor, among surplus labor in rural area started to decline. So further migration will have to come at higher wage, basically will make wages increase. So that all this suggests that the rebellion, we're talking about rebalancing, is happening. So I don't know whether that they answer your question. Now, inequality, of course, the reform measures, all these things we talked about, in short term, perhaps will slow down growth a little bit, but will make growth more sustainable in medium and long term. So that in that perspective, and will create more jobs. So in that perspective, they will contribute. Quality growth, better quality of growth will contribute to reducing inequality. So this is our view. Yeah. Now the second question is environment. Now we did a study on. We looked at China, the provincial level data, tested Kuznets hypothesis, environmental Kuznets. That actually we found the turning point is about $10,000 US. So look at the provincial data and the relationship between we look at the pollution. Actually this mechanism works, and about $10,000 US, then the level of this start to decline. But of course, China has many provinces like Shanghai, Beijing, and the already very high income level. So in that sense, what you said is right. In a sense, even within China, it works. So your question is about the tax. Yes. Okay. Actually, in China, also less than 2% of the population pay income tax, similar as India. So obviously, personal income tax. Now, of course, we are not talking about corporate income tax. Corporate income tax, China, many countries, 2 to 3% of the GDP is similar to OECD average. So that corporate, we are not saying corporate tax should not be increased. We're saying that should not be increased. But personal income tax, at the moment, Asia as a whole is less than 2% of GDP. OECD is about 6 to 8% of GDP. And I think it was a mileage to go there. But of course, as you said, income tax increase, competitiveness. So maybe the corporate income tax, of course, is a very direct impact on the competitiveness. But personal income tax, maybe less compared to corporate income tax, but still may have some impact on competitiveness in a sense. But still, the question is, the developed countries have a very high income tax, right? So in a sense, and then in developing countries, developing Asia, labor costs still low. In China, unit labor cost of the manufacturing sector is about 10% of the US level. So still that very competitive. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We should be okay.
I have my own microphone. I can just add to Ju Song's comments there. I agree with all what you say. I'm just adding to it. I think one of the biggest macroeconomic megatrends coming on now is the rebalancing of the growth model. I mean, from investment-led and export-led growth to more consumption-led. And in that sense, I think that also is a strategy to reduce the inequality and have more poor people to consume more. And I think one of the most important trends that is following that strategy is also the urbanization in China, because what's special with China is that the urbanization rate is 53%. That's the share of people living in urban area versus total. So 47 still lives in rural areas, and that percentage is actually the same percentage as United States for 100 years ago. I mean, in US today, I think it's 85 or something, the urbanization rate, and in Norway, I think it's 85 as well. People live in the big cities. So I think in completing the consumption story, which is a long-term story, because some of my colleagues, which is like very short-term investors, they think that consumption is coming tomorrow. I mean, you can't turn the growth model during a couple of years. I think it's more like a 5, 10, maybe 15-year strategy. But I think it will come, because I think the point is that you have like a natural dampening of the urbanization rate today, because you have the hookah system, right? People can't just move to urban areas or cities in China. You can move, but you don't have the social welfare. So you have to, if you get sick, you have to go back and everything. So there's like a barrier to move to the cities. But the government's plan is that the urbanization is growing with 1 percentage point every year. So every year you have like, I mean, 1.3 billion people is like 30 million rural people moving into the cities every year. So that will move people from the agricultural, because most of the rural people work in the agricultural sector, into industry or service industry. And that's also to complete, especially in the service industry, to complete the story around the consumption story. Because today, the manufacturing has to manufacture products that you export. Too much, right? You manufacture too much and then have to export. But the next leg is to have more service industry, which is much smaller. And for people going to agricultural to service industry will make a big change. And that's also part of the consumption story, because consumption and service is quite linked. Because if you can think of it, I mean, most of the service industry is consumption. I mean, you go to the movies, you go not skiing in China, but you go on a vacation, you go out eating. That's service industry, and that's very not developed in China. So the urbanization story, I think, is the gradual consumption story. You can link it up to the consumption story. And you have this gradual loosening up of the hookah system that lets you have the 1 percentage point every year. I think that's very important, how the structure of the both demographic works and how the growth model will work in the future in China as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Last words from Arne, if you wish.
Just very briefly, that when we sit in Norway and looking at Asia, we tend to simplify because we don't know enough about it. So we kind of think a little too much about Southeast and East Asia. Now we'll know more about South Asia, etc. But we tend to generalize, and so we just have to remember the huge disparities within the region. And for example, in some part, let's say South Asia, let's say for example, gender issues is of another significance. For example, the workforce participation in India for women is much lower than in China, so that kind of creates a completely different picture about the kind of demographic dividend. So this kind of diversity in the region is important to recall, so we don't make too sweeping assumptions.
Excellent, thank you.
Do I get a last word?
Would you like? Or?
Sure. Is this working?
Yep.
I just want to reiterate that I didn't want to criticize at all by bringing up political issues. There's enough to talk about just with the economy, but in interpreting the results, I think it's important to see it in the context of politics. And I think particularly it can serve as a reminder for why it's not so easy to just implement the great answers we seem to have about economics and why that doesn't happen. But I also want to make one short point about the taxation and the income tax rates. Of course, India has VAT and really high alcohol taxes, which is a huge state revenue, and they do have quite a bit of taxation. But the issue with income tax, also from a state capacity perspective, is important, because if you don't have income tax, you don't need to have good records of addresses and have control of the population, which actually we have seen in many. We have seen in many contexts. For example, many oil-rich government has led to really weak state capacity because of a weak need for institution building, which then down the line has economic consequences. So income taxation is important in terms of state building in itself, and I think that's something that Asia also, should keep in mind. But thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Francesca. Thank you to our speaker and panelists, and to the State Secretary for coming, and thank you to the audience.